Thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Lester, and I am the social media manager and the French wine correspondent for the Napa Valley Wine Academy. We offer classes online worldwide at 10 different locations, and we are the WSET leader in the US, successfully certifying more students anywhere in the world outside of London. We also offer free webinars, podcasts, and articles, and we have several proprietary programs, including the American Wine Expert, which has just been recently relaunched this month. And in celebration of our relaunch, we are taking you on a road trip across the United States to visit some fabulous producers and talk more about their specific region. And today I'm joined by Joshua Maloney, the consulting winemaker at Aquilini Wines. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So let's just start out with you telling me first where you are and your AVA and your region.
Sure. I'm near my kitchen, which happens to be in Richland, Washington. So I'm in Eastern Washington State, and I'm right close to the Red Mountain appellation of Washington.
Mm-hmm. The Red Mountain has quite the reputation. I think when we talk about Washington wines, that's the AVA that most people talk about in terms of producing some very high quality wines, especially the red wines, correct?
That's correct. I would say that if you were to look up just by acclaim, the highest ranking wines ever coming out of Washington, virtually all of them, most of them at least, have come from Red Mountain.
Mm-hmm. And what are the dominant grape varietals that you have?
So with Aquilini, I would say I believe at least 60% of the vineyards are planted to Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet is king, and on Red Mountain, that's no different. We also have a great deal of Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Malbec, and Petit Verdot planted. So all the five Bordeaux varieties, and a little bit of Syrah, as well as a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc. But it's almost entirely red grapes.
All right. And can you tell me a little about the actual climate of your region itself?
Sure. So, and for anyone who's not familiar with Washington State's grape growing, this is going to come as a bit of a shock, but it's actually very, very warm here. In fact, one of the ways that we measure how warm an area is with growing degree days. And it's basically, I won't go into the specifics of how that is measured, but it's basically a measure of how much heat a region sees throughout the growing year. Mm-hmm. And we in Eastern Washington in general, we typically get about as many growing degree days as Napa Valley does, some of the warmer parts of Napa Valley in particular. So the biggest difference, though, is that in parts of California where they see all that heat, they see it typically over a good 1 to 2 months longer of a growing season than we see in Washington. And our growing season is condensed a little bit compared to most parts of California. In fact, our growing season, the length of it is actually more on par with Bordeaux than it is with California. But this time of year, it can get very hot. It's been getting hotter more in recent years. In fact, a couple of days ago, we tied a record for hottest temperature in June at 117 degrees Fahrenheit.
It was 107. Oh my gosh.
It was 117 on Tuesday. Yeah.
Wow.
That's a bit much.
I saw the news that was like that in Seattle and Portland, and I was thinking about Eastern Washington, and indeed, wow, 117. That's pretty significant. That's just in terms of what's happening currently in your vineyards. How has or will that affect your vintage this year?
Well, it's hard to say right now, to be honest. That much heat is never good, period. But we have just moved out of the flowering stage and into berry sets a few weeks ago. So right now in the vineyard, we're the part of the process where the berries are going from really, really small up to the actual size where they're going to be when they're ready to be picked. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of cell division taking place right now in the grapes themselves. When we have temperatures like this, it can stunt some of the growth. So it can also cause sunburn, which is not a good thing. It actually will make some of the berries abort and fall off. So it depends on the vineyard and how well the vineyard managers did with their water and things like that. That's the impact could be minimal in terms of it could be that we just have smaller berries this year, which is actually a great thing for red wine.
Okay.
Or it could be that we may have unintentionally fried some of the berries off and lost some crop in the process. We're not really sure yet, unfortunately.
Okay. And what are some of the other weather factors that impact that area? Or do the Cascade Mountains have an impact on grape growing areas?
Yeah, and thank you for asking. That was the other element that I wanted to mention, that not a lot of people realize about Washington State and farming in general, but grape growing in particular, is that Eastern Washington exists in what's called the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. So most people, when you say Washington State, you think Seattle, and you think, coffee, grunge music, and it's cloudy and it's wet and it's cold.
Yeah.
Well, all that wet weather that's coming in from the Pacific Ocean, it kind of gets jammed up right near Seattle and the Woodinville area, where there's a lot of wineries, because the Cascade Mountains are right after that. And rather than the clouds getting over the hills, a lot of them just drop their rain on the west side of the mountain. So the east side of the state gets very, very little rain. Where I live, Tri-Cities and Red Mountain in particular, averages about 6 to 8 inches of rain annually.
Wow.
It's one of the driest places in the United States.
Extremely dry. Yeah, it's extremely dry.
But all that rain that gets dumped in the Cascades, and then a lot of rain that gets dumped in the Rocky Mountains up in British Columbia, falls as snow in the winter, and it creates a large snowpack, and that melts and it feeds the Yakima River and the Columbia River. And that's essentially where we get all the water we need for the irrigation of the grapes, to keep the grapes alive, to keep the vines alive.
Okay. So it's very dry there too. And what are the specific soil types that most of the vines grow on?
Well, it's largely very, very sandy soils around here. This area was shaped by an event in the Ice Age called the Missoula floods, which we could spend a good 30 minutes talking about that. And so I would just, encourage people, if you're not familiar with the Missoula floods, just Google it. There's also some great videos on it. But basically, what happened about 10 to 15,000 years ago is that a giant ice dam built up in around Missoula, Montana, and a huge lake formed behind it. When I say huge, it's approximately the size of one of the Great Lakes. And then what they can tell by looking at the geologic record is that the ice dam broke in one catastrophic moment. It released all that water, and it effectively came through Eastern Washington and parts of northern Oregon, and just scoured out the landscape, taking everything with it, and leaving behind lots of broken basalt and sand. And it actually happened a number of times. It just didn't happen just once, but you can imagine if you were there 10 or 15,000 years ago, suddenly you might, feel some rumbling. You might hear something and look up, and there's a wall of water almost 1,000 feet high coming at you.
Wow.
That's how catastrophic.
This was.
So
it's a huge impact.
Yeah, but so the soils are fairly uniform in most areas. Mostly a lot of sandy soils, but the benefit for us with having the soil type is that it does not hold water very well. So if we accidentally over irrigate, or if we get some rain that we're not expecting, the rain basically just kind of passes by the root zone, and if the roots don't grab it on the way down, they miss it. So in other words, we have incredibly fine control over how much water the vines get.
Yeah. And the impact of that itself, and in terms of the irrigation, is there a lot of irrigation too that's taking place from the rivers as well?
Well, it's again, pretty much all the water that the vines get in the growing season comes from the rivers. But the really cool thing about having this much control over the irrigation is that we can intentionally limit the amount of water that the vines see during certain parts of the year, to do things like limit canopy, limit the amount of leaf growth, so that we don't get too much. You guys are probably familiar with the notion that when you're growing grapes, you've got a vine, The vine is making energy from sunlight, and it can put that energy either into making leaves or into ripening grapes. And so at a certain time of the year, you want the vine to stop making leaves and start focusing on the grapes instead. And if you keep feeding it water, it's going to think to itself, well, I can keep growing grapes. I'm really happy. I can do whatever I want. And so you want to kind of shut down the canopy growth at certain times of year so that it will then switch into ripening mode instead. If you get rain during certain times of the year, you can't really control that. We can control that.
Yeah.
So we can grow the 3 to 4 feet of canopy growth and then turn the water down and have it stop exactly where we want it, rather than coming through. If you've ever driven through some areas with lots of vines, they look like they have a haircut. They're all really kind of uniform on the top. That's because the vineyards have gone through and they've hedged. They've actually cut the tops off to try and do this instead. We can do it just with water. But the other cool thing, and this really has a big impact on the quality, and I kind of alluded to it earlier when you were asking about the heat, is that provided that we're not having these scorching temperatures this time of year, we can limit the water that the vines see during this phase of the grape growing, and we can actually intentionally create smaller berries in the grape clusters. And the smaller the berry, the more skins you have to juice. So really large berries, the skins are larger, of course, but there's more juice. If you do some math and just do surface area versus volume, you can figure this out. I won't go to the math, but the smaller the berry, basically the more concentrated the wine, because with red wines, virtually all of the flavor and all of the color and all the tannin are coming from the skins themselves.
So therefore it has a lot more, you're able to extract more.
We can extract more. In fact, when I moved to Washington in 2005, I was working in California before this. I was caught off guard my first vintage because I was unaware of how much tannin the grapes have here. And I over extracted a number of wines before I finally learned how to extract properly from Washington fruit.
Control that. So how long have you been making wine?
So my first vintage was actually 1997 in the Finger Lakes of New York. Very, very different grape growing area than Washington.
Very different. My last interview was with Finger Lakes.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah, actually, I did earlier today was Finger Lakes. So.
Oh, fantastic! I missed that area. I'm from upstate New York originally. I went to college there too. So
fabulous.
In fact, I will say, so I've worked. I've made wine in the Finger Lakes. I lived in Napa for a year. I lived in Monterey for 5 years. I'm in Washington right now. The prettiest area I've ever lived during harvest is the Finger Lakes.
Okay.
Seeing the Finger Lakes with the New England colors. But anyways, we're not here to talk about the
Finger Lakes.
Yeah.
Everybody can go over to the other video to talk about that, but we are focusing on Washington State.
But I will say that, started in the Finger Lakes. I moved to Napa for a year. Then I said Monterey for 5 years. 2005, I moved to Washington. So I've been making wine for a little over 20 years. In the past 15 plus years, I've been in Washington.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your winery itself. Can you take me through, you took me a little bit into your vineyard practices. Can we talk about what happens at harvest and the winemaking process, and maybe what some of the techniques are that you find more in Washington versus perhaps the Finger Lakes? We kind of touched on that in terms of extraction and things like that. So maybe with the harvest, do you do a lot of sorting in the vineyard? Can you talk me through the process?
Yeah, so I'll and there's a lot to cover here because Aquilini has over 500 acres planted in Red Mountain.
It's a lot.
They are.
Wow.
It kind of goes back and forth. They are either the largest or second largest grower in Red Mountain, and produces wines that range from as low as $12 a bottle up to, I believe it's either $150 or $200 a bottle. So it's a huge range of wine pricing and quality. And so, of course, how it's picked, how it's sorted, how it's fermented, it's all going to depend on where it's going. You know, it's the winemaking that you employ for a $12 wine is obviously not the same that the winemaking that you employ for a $150 bottle of wine. But generally speaking, you know, we're coming up, it's right around the corner, it seems, to harvest, which is going to start probably late August, early September. The Sauvignon Blanc, the early whites will start late August. The early reds like the Merlot and some of the Cabernet Francs will start in September. And then the Cabernet Sauvignon typically doesn't start until about the first or second week of October. Again, depending on where it's going, we're either going to machine pick it or we're going to hand pick it. The higher the price point, the more sorting that's involved, the more likely we are going to hand pick it instead of machine picking it. And that's partly because we have more control over the sorting of the fruit, but it's also because, and this is going to go into maybe a little more geeky detail than you're intending to talk about today.
I like geeky details.
Fantastic. Okay.
Yeah. And I think our students will too.
The amount of whole berry that we get into the fermenter is going to have a big impact on the tannin management. Okay, so I put a lot, I think, into that sentence. Let me kind of unpack it for you. So first of all, tannin management. That's the first thing, and this is the part that I alluded to earlier that I struggled with when I first moved to Washington. A lot of the places I worked in California, and I'm not saying this is where it's done everywhere in California, but the places I worked had an approach with winemaking where we're going to taste the fruit in the vineyard, we're going to pick it when we think it's ready, which is what we do in Washington too. But we're going to bring it to the winery, and then with the reds, we destem it, we crush it maybe, we put it into the tank, the seeds, the skins, the pulp, juice, everything. And then we have a set number of days already prescribed for us that we're going to ferment on the skins. Fermenting on the skins is where we get our color, we get our tannin, we get a lot of our flavor. And then in those wineries, we would just hit that number of days, and then we would drain and press, and then take the wine down to barrel from malolactic fermentation. And then we would work on shaping the wines then. Okay. Now, what I tried that in Washington, and I realized that the amount of tannin that I was extracting was all over the place. And in many cases, it was just too much. And so what I do now in Washington is tasting the fruit, waiting for the right flavors, waiting for the right mouthfeel. When it's ready, we pick it, we bring it in, we destem it. We never crush it because crushing increases the extraction. We get into the tank, and then after about 3 or 4 days when it starts fermenting, we're tasting it sometimes as much as twice a day while we're doing our cap management, our punch downs and our pump overs. And we're looking for the right point to do the drain and press. And it might be as little as 7 days. It might be as many as 45.
Wow, that's a huge range.
It really depends, again, on the fruit, the vintage, the vineyard, the variety, and where the wine is going. And so every single fermenter is customized. So we try and drain and press at the exact right time. And one of the really cool benefits of doing it this way is that let me double check this statement before I make it out loud. I have not used any fining agents on any red wines in Washington for well over 10 years.
Wow. Because
I want to shape the wine in the fermenter, not in the barrel. So by the time it gets to the barrel, at that point, the mouthfeel, I'm always looking for a very continuous line from the entry through the mid palate all the way to the finish. Just a nice smooth line, and how big and how long it is depends again on where the wine is going. But if I do the fermentation correctly, by the time it gets down to the barrel, at that point, I'm just adding barrel influence, and I'm just kind of rounding the edges and helping it kind of come into focus a little bit more. So the comment that I made at the beginning of this long explanation was that whole berry, so whole berry as opposed to crushed berries, I should mention, is one of the more important and effective tools for managing grapes that have a lot of tannin. So if we're dealing with the grapes that have been farmed at really low tons per acre, have a lot of concentration, they're very, very small, they're going to be incredibly powerful and rich and dense. And it's going to be very easy to either over extract those grapes or awkwardly extract them, so that we get a lot of stuff out, but it just doesn't fit together. It's all kind of jumbled, and it's got pokey edges in the mouthfeel and things like that. having unbroken berries in the fermenter helps soften that impact and gives us more time to gently extract what we're looking for.
And
So,
have that aroma out. That's
yeah.
really interesting, and I really like actually how you do the comparison to the other regions, because I think that's really important too. That not every region's the same, and you having experience and working in different regions, you can tell how all of that is
Yeah.
getting impacted.
Well,
It's a
and
really
it's one of my personal things. Yeah, one of my personal things I kind of get, on a soapbox about sometimes, but when a lot of people say that they're trying to make like a Bordeaux type wine or an Italian type wine in Washington or in California, I understand if you want to have some influence of that style, but if you really want to make a Bordeaux wine, you have to go to Bordeaux.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you really want to make a Tuscan wine, you have to go to Tuscany. It's the ground here, the climate here, the angle that the sunlight's hitting our grapes, it all influences the flavors and the qualities that we're getting. And I think it's much more interesting to try and celebrate that than to
Absolutely.
try to reproduce something from the other part of someplace, halfway around the world instead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to create a footprint and identity of the place that you're at. It's one of
Exactly.
the most beautiful things. I mean, that can probably go across the board in a lot of things, but I won't go on a tangent, a tangent at my soapbox about that. But no,
well,
and
we're kind of talking about terroir here, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know there are some people who kind of dispute the notion, but I remember reading a story about somebody who grew up in like 1930s or 1940s Texas, and they said that they could tell the difference just by drinking milk, whether it came from their neighbor's farm or the farm across the town, because they tasted differently based on where the cows were grazing. So it's an obvious quality that's inherent in everything that we do.
Absolutely. And it's a huge, part of our identity, and terroir can, where the grapes are from. And I think having a beautiful sense of place of where you are, it's like when you go to Washington State, I would love to taste Washington State, right? That's
right.
Kind of the beauty of it. Well, before we wrap up, I would like to ask you one last question. And that is, what are the key takeaways that you think are important for anybody who's studying wine, and wine professionals to know about Washington State? And that's kind of a broad question, but maybe personally, you can take that question however you want. But the key important takeaways.
So, for the longest time, Washington has been sort of billed as a great place for high value wines. So if you want a lot of bang for your buck, it's, I'd say in the past 10 or 15 years, I think a lot of people are now recognizing that the quality that's coming out of Washington is not, it's not being bound by the price. That the wines being produced here can stand toe to toe with the best wines from around the world. But, and this is a statistic that's thrown out a lot by a lot of Washington wine growers. I believe it's 45% of all of the wines rated from Washington in one of the major publications score 90 or higher over the past 10 or 15 years. And I think the only region that actually exceeds that is Bordeaux. And I think that they're like 46 or 47%. So not by much.
Wow.
But the main difference is that I want to say that the average price per bottle that goes with that is like $40 or $45, as opposed to 100 and 150. So not only are there exceptionally high quality wines being made here, but they are exceptionally affordable as well in comparison to the major wine growing regions from around the world. Obviously in the past, I would say the two big varieties that Washington had been known for are Riesling and Merlot. And I do feel like the Merlot from Washington is unlike Merlot from anywhere else in the world. Merlot is typically added to a blend to sort of soften the blend and add some kind of, jammy, fruity components and sort of, almost kind of simplify the wine a little bit. Merlot in Washington can be so dense and rich that we'll have to add Cabernet to soften it.
Wow.
And that's not to say that the Cabernet here is a wallflower. Cabernets can be very, very big here, but Merlot is very, very different in Washington. So
Mhm.
that's sort of the history, I think, about the wines that we are known for. But I feel personally the Cabernet is the best variety that we do in Washington. And to me, the hallmark of a really, well, I'd say really good, but even an average Washington red wine is a really rich, almost sweet, but not actually sugar sweet, mid palate density.
Mhm.
So if you like wines where you take a sip and it just kind of sits in your mouth and it fills out your palate, and you just get this really kind of rich coating feeling as you're drinking it,
I'm very thirsty
that's sort
right
of,
now.
what's that?
You're making me extremely thirsty. I really wish I had some Washington wine right now.
Yeah. But that's sort of it's a really common
Yeah,
quality to find in
yeah,
Washington reds,
absolutely.
right? I often say that if you can't get good mid palate density from Washington red wine, you should probably reconsider your career, because
Yeah,
it's actually it's very easy to find
yeah.
in the grapes here.
Wow.
So
Um, Thank you. I would love to have some Washington wine right now.
well, if I could ship some to you
It's
easily, I
making me
would,
miss
but it'd
all
be
of it. But I would love to know, how do our students get hold of your wines?
we should look that up before. So
Okay, we can also put it in I can also put it in our notes
yeah,
too. You
let
can,
me so
yeah.
Aquilini Wines has a wine shop, and I'm
Okay.
just looking up the URL for it. So let's offline, I'll look that up and I'll give it to you. You can put it
Yeah,
in the
send that to me. And
okay.
thank you so much for taking your time to speak with me and
Well,
speak
it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
on behalf of the Napa Valley Wine Academy. And it's really been a pleasure learning from you. I have a lot of takeaways personally. So thank you
Oh,
for
thank you.
that time.